Okay, in the Harold Gene Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies at Arizona State. Wonderful.
The Harold and Gene Grossman Chair.
Not Harold Gene, huh?
Yeah, not Harold Gene. That's actually wrong on the book cover.
Oh no!
Yeah, but whatever.
Oh yeah, look at that.
Yeah, I haven't even told him yet because it's like, I guess it's no harm, no done. She passed away, Jean Grossman, so there's no one to really complain.
Welcome everybody.
Everyone feel a little bit lighter after this week than you did last week?
No.
No.
No, I'm not actually. Me personally, I'm I don't know. There's a transfer of powers, should be smoother. So no.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, and Arizona. That's interesting.
Yeah, I like to think that I played a small part in that.
Oh, by moving there.
and Rachel was a state captain for the election defenders.
What's that?
She was the one giving all those annoying text messages, and and when there was like threats being made like at the polling stations, she had to like call the police, and she did everything from the house.
Wow.
So yeah, she got a lot of there's a lot of vitriol, but she also got to see the inside track of what was happening. It was really scary. But it was funny. We moved to Phoenix. It's a little bit more blue, and from where we were before, and you could see all the American flags on our street popping up on Yom Shabbat. Like
I found that. Yeah, I saw that here a little bit. I found, it's weird. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. Like,
yeah.
The same flag the day before,
Yeah, but it was like, I understood it. Like,
I understand, but I
felt a little less ashamed to be American.
Yeah. Country. All right, Dora, whenever you want to start, we can wait. We can start.
Yeah, let's wait another 2-3 minutes. We have about little less than half the registries.
Oh, so then we'll definitely wait.
Yeah, let's wait another 3-4 minutes. People are still coming in.
I saw that
you're in your university office.
I am. This is the office.
And you're giving classes in person, or it's all on Zoom?
So it's bizarre. Like, so we started with a sync modality. So I had a couple students in the classroom, and the university spent millions of dollars to install all kinds of technology that never actually works.
Does it
doesn't work very well? No, I had terrible experiences with it. And so I started off in person, and then in my smaller, more focused, like medieval Jewish history class, that ended up going completely on Zoom once our room had a leak, and there was only like 4 people attending out of 45. So it was like there was no point in changing rooms. So I went on Zoom there, and then I teach a big, huge survey, like 135 students, global history to 1500, and that one I had about 20 students that were coming. And I was still doing it in person like 2 weeks ago. And then, or really last week. Last week was my first full week on Zoom. And I just decided with the rising COVID that it was too dangerous.
You had 135 people in the class, or that's total?
No. I had I had a sign-up sheet where it was limited to just 20 seats in a huge auditorium. So there was social distancing.
Yeah.
But in truth, only 8 or so came regularly, and I guess I apparently was one of the last holdouts to continue to stay in person, and we're already scheduled to go completely sync mode in the for the spring.
Meaning the combined.
Yeah, meaning combined, but there's only classes that are under 100 are going to be completely on Zoom. So
over 100.
Yeah, anything over 100.
Right.
Yeah. So and I have a feeling that this sync mode is here to stay. Like I doubt that we'll ever go back to a completely in-person classroom again. Yeah. It just most of the students don't want to come into the classroom and they'd rather be on Zoom. And it's really unfortunate and sad. It's not as fun to teach that way at all. It really, you lose a lot, and it takes a lot of the joy away from me. And it's also exhausting because it's like you're generating all the momentum and energy of a class yourself, because there's so little interaction with the students.
Yeah.
We're having a problem.
Do
In
you
fact,
do
our
breakout
enrollments are way
rooms?
down for the spring.
Do you do breakout rooms?
No, I don't, because it's only like 50-minute classes, and one of them is a huge survey, so I haven't done that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I have much smaller classes, and I use it a lot, with varying success, but I think it works. I mean, my students also have the model of Chavruta, so it's not totally foreign to them,
Yeah.
but they often are like, I show up and they're like, I'll show up into the breakout room and they're like, wait, what were we supposed to do?
Yeah.
So I have to structure it better, but it does break up the zoominess of it, right? It's like,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've been trying to introduce more Chavruta style learning with our majors. We have a couple majors, and so I've been trying to get them to learn together and work on their projects together. And it's so foreign to them. They haven't, they have never seen a Chavruta model of learning, but it's tried and true, proven.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is, and it allows them to look, I think, close up to the sources, primary sources, in a way that on their own it's hard to do reading, and you explaining it for them is not the same educationally.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a pretty full class now, so or room, I guess it's not a class. Now you were talking about classes. And so I'm going to say welcome to everybody. Thank you. You want to put in the chat where you're from, or if you want to say something. I see some people already did. Thank you. Hello, Jennifer and Marla. But I'd like to welcome our special guest today, our speaker. I'll let Professor Perellis introduce him formally, but I did want to say that I am greatly enjoying the book and had not before done a deep dive into wills. And this is a totally new venture for me. So to me, this is great to hear you and read the book. So thank you. And thank you for joining us and expanding on it a bit more. Just some logistics before we start. All the attendees are on mute and on that they can't open their cameras. And that will stay until the end of Professor Mirvis's discussion. If there's something that you really have to ask or really need to understand, put it in the chat. I will be monitoring it the whole time. And if you have questions that you would like him to answer at the end, stick it into the Q&A, but also I'll open up I'll allow you to open your microphones and cameras at the end. So that's my little logistics thing. I'll pass it over to Professor Perellis, and I'll see you another Sunday.
Thank you so much, Drora. I want to start by thanking the ASF and Drora for dreaming up this fantastic series of New Works Wednesdays. Thank God we have so much great new scholarship on the varied, complex, exciting history of Sephardic Jews around the world. And this book by Stan Mirvis is no exception. And I have a real honor in introducing Professor Mirvis. He's an old friend, and I have a professional piece of nachas here, which is that Stan, before my time at Yeshiva University, Stan not only got his BA, but also his MA from Bernard Revel Graduate School, where I happily teach now. And I wish I would have had him. It would have been really great to have him in the classroom. But as a colleague, I have learned so much from talking with Professor Mirvis. And what's wonderful about this book, as you'll see, is this is the fruit of years of archival work, of literally going into the archive, which maybe Professor Mirvis could explain a little bit what that was like for him to go to the archive in one of Kingston's most dangerous neighborhoods, and finding, taking out of these very dry legal documents, often very repetitive documents, and creating a network of life out of it, and understanding that this is a whole society, and these are levels to the society. This is a community that is diverse and complicated and requires a lot of thinking. Well, what was this life for these people? And his years of hard work and thinking, comes out in this book. But something else that Professor Mirvis brings, thanks to his, I want to give a shout out to his thesis director, Professor Gerber, Jane Gerber, who will be with us next week. It's really an honor to have her here. Is that he's able to take the breadth and depth of the wider Jewish historical experience, and really actually the wider Western historical experience, to this very focused work of history. And so at once you're going to see much more than the specific focus, but that focus is informed by this much more expansive narrative. So, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Mirvis, who is, I want to give, first of all, he's speaking to us from the lovely campus of ASU in Tempe. If you are in the area, it's a beautiful campus. I happened to be there once. Great botanical garden, a lot of cacti, obviously. So Professor Mirvis, Professor Stanley Mirvis, is an assistant professor of history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies at Arizona State. And without any further ado, Professor Mirvis.
Thank you, Ronnie, for that introduction. That was really beautiful to hear that from you. And I feel humbled to hear that, because the respect is a two-way street. And in fact, in the book, I in a lot of ways am dedicated or informed by some of your perspectives as well. And also, I want to recognize my thesis advisor, who's here today, Jane Gerber. And really, Jane Gerber made this whole project possible. I take very little credit for the conception of the idea, which I credit Jane Gerber with. And I went and did the work of sitting in the archives, sure, but the genesis of it all really was in Jane Gerber's office at CUNY Grad Center, when we would sit and discuss how to do a dissertation, and then how to make that into a book at some point, which is where we are today. So thank you all for the kind words, and thank you, Jorah, for organizing this. So what I'll do today is I want to talk a little bit about just the bare bones history of Jews in Jamaica and what that looks like in the 18th century, since I find that that's often a somewhat curious and underexplored territory of Jewish history. And I'll try to connect it, as Ronnie said, to broader trends in Jewish and global history during the 18th century. And I'll do that for about 20 minutes. And then after that, I'll talk more specifically about the primary source space that's at the heart of my research, which is last will and testaments, and why I decided to focus on wills and what I did with them. What are some of the promise that wills hold for social historical analysis, and then I'll give you some of my broad conclusions. So Jews in Jamaica have very uncertain origins. They are part of a Western Sephardi diaspora, which could be called a Portuguese diaspora. And what that means is that there were two very distinct different parts of a diaspora, of Sephardi diaspora, that emerges in the wake of 1492. The Eastern world, the Ottoman, Islamic, Mediterranean, where Spanish continues to be at the heart of the linguistic identity of Sephardi Jews. A lot of them were Megurashim, who had left as Jews. in 1492. And then there is a Western diaspora, which emerges a little bit later, after 1580, really, when Portugal was annexed to Spain, which effectively erased the border, allowing conversos who were truly crypto-Jewish, which was a largely Portuguese phenomenon, to enter into Spain and have an influence there. And then from Spain over the Pyrenees border into southwestern France, particularly the city of Bayonne and Saint-Jean-de-Luz border towns. And from there, make their way to Protestant Western Europe that had extended some degree of tolerance to Portuguese Jews. In some cases, very extreme levels of tolerance, like as in Livorno, where Portuguese Jews had a charter that really granted them almost complete autonomy, to Amsterdam, where they didn't really have the right for public worship, but they lived in a place where you could live openly as a Jew. And it's in Amsterdam where you really see the emergence of a mother community for the entirety of a Portuguese-speaking diaspora. They don't really call themselves Sephardim. They call themselves something like, men of the nation or men of lineage. And this is really important for them because what makes them very distinct from a Eastern Sephardi diaspora is that all of them had the experience of living as conversos. And so that means they bring a lot of Catholicism with them. The process of rejudaization is a very complex one that gives rise to new forms of expression and literature, and in some cases heterodoxy, in some cases you can call radical orthodoxy, as in the case of Isaac Robio de Castro, and everything in between. So Amsterdam, because of its wealth, the wealthy Jewish courtiers that courtier may be an inaccurate term, but wealthy Jewish court Jews that are connected to the stock exchange, and also the quality of its great academy, the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, that is really focused on integrating former conversos into the Jewish fold, which is a very difficult thing to do, which requires also more biblical focus. And it's from Amsterdam that you really see the emergence of a Western Sephardi diaspora. And I'll just say this quickly, Western and Eastern is a little bit complicated because it's not really a geographic term or a geographic identity, in that many people who were Portuguese speaking, who had been conversos, make their way to the Ottoman world and vice versa. A lot of the rabbis that are serving in the Portuguese diaspora are really from Ottoman Jewish origins, who had come to the West, migrated to the West. And so it's using the term Western and Eastern comes with its problems, although it is quite a useful way of thinking about the various reactions, diasporic reactions to 1492. So that's where this all fits within a Sephardic studies context. So Jamaica was a part of the Spanish Empire since the 16th century. And so it's quite likely that there were conversos living there. I would say it's almost impossible that there aren't conversos living in Jamaica. And there's good evidence that of a Portuguese presence in the Spanish world of Jamaica, as in all parts of the Spanish Americas. After, in the beginning of the 17th century, the 1600s, there emerges an inquisition from Cartagena in Colombia that has authority over the entirety of the Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Colombia, and in Latin America. So those places are really under the auspices of a local inquisition, which means that you might think that Jamaica would have been a good place to go if you were a crypto Jew. Maybe you'd be off the radar of the Inquisition, but as it turns out, it wasn't. That said, I'm unaware of any specific cases of Judaizing being tried in Cartagena of Jews in Jamaica. Doesn't mean it didn't exist. Those records are almost completely lost to us, and so we only have a very small, only a small fraction of those cases. So it stands to reason that there were, we can assume, I think, that there were crypto-Jewish conversos living in Spanish Jamaica. And they may have been among the first Jews to live in Jamaica after 1655, when Jamaica becomes English. Captured by Oliver Cromwell in the Western Design, a kind of messianic, very Puritan effort to wrest the Caribbean away from the Spanish. This was, and I say this was a very religious as much as it was a political movement. Those that were involved in this Western design were would do radical fasting and penitence before battles. So it was a deeply Puritan endeavor. And Jamaica was captured by the British. Now this happened 8 months after Portuguese Jews were exiled from Brazil, which had been the first serious Jewish community in the New World. Now that doesn't mean that there was a direct connection between Brazil and Jamaica. In fact, there's no reason to think there was. There's 8 months after, and in fact, the Jews that left Brazil in 1654 were a vastly dwindled population than what they had been. Most had left much earlier. So what happens after 1654, many Jews go to Amsterdam, they go to Livorno, they go to London, and then from there make their way onto the British Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica. And Barbados had already been a site of Jewish settlement since very early on, since the 1640s, because it had not been Spanish. So after 1605, you start to see the possibility of a Jewish community on the island of Jamaica. It takes a long time, though, for one to actually emerge. There's some evidence of individual Jews. A lot of them are prospectors looking for gold or other types of precious metals. They're using this. They're prospecting to try to negotiate settlement rights, and those tend to be really limited to those individuals. And what that means is that it's not until the 1670s when you start to see an actual community take shape. The beginnings of burial in Jewish cemeteries, the first evidence of there possibly being some kind of synagogue structure, and the first time that non-Jewish travelers and observers and ethnographers start to mention Jews living there. And it's in the 1670s when you start to see Jews also factoring in to the discourse of the governor and the assembly of Jamaica. So the way that Jamaica works is that there is a crown appointed governor, and he has a council that operates similarly to a House of Lords in a parliamentary system. And then there's a locally elected assembly, and they tend to be at odds with each other over the character of the colony. Will the colony be more of a mercantile facing colony? Will be more of an agricultural colony? And this is really at the heart of the divide between assembly made up of local Jamaican planters, really, and the governor and his council made up more of mercantile-minded officers. So Jews are kind of caught a little bit in between in that divide. So really by the 1680s, you start to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 Jews possibly living in Port Royal, which is a city that had been neglected by the Spanish entirely. It had not been a city under the Spanish, and that the British turned into a major trading port. Now, Port Royal was a very effective port because Kingston Harbor could protect a privateering and naval fleet all year round, which was pretty special and unique. I think only maybe New York Harbor had the same promise in the 18th century. So it allowed the British to keep a very regular presence in the Caribbean. And by virtue of that, Port Royal turns into a really serious trading hub. Although it's not a very easy place to live. There's no indigenous water source. They import most of their food from other Caribbean islands in North America. So it comes with some difficulties, but it was a place remarkable for its religious, ethnic diversity. It had Catholics living there, even though it was the Protestant world. It had lots of Protestant dissenters living in Port Royal, Huguenot and Mennonite and Quaker were living in Port Royal. And of course, a small community of Portuguese Jews. And a small amount of also Ashkenazi Jews who also made their way on the heels of the Portuguese to Port Royal. So Port Royal looked like a pretty prosperous place. Protestant dissenters were given full liberty in Port Royal, and Jews were also extended religious tolerance. And there's a lot of reason to believe that they built a synagogue as well in Port Royal. Now it all came crashing to a halt in 1692, in June of 1692, when a major earthquake brought a tsunami that devastated the city. And in fact, to this day, most of Port Royal is under the sea, and it's been the site of a lot of fantastical, even underwater archaeology in shark-infested waters. So there remains a significant amount of archaeology that's happening in Port Royal. So with that, the Jewish community really evaporates. And there's various reports. One fascinating report comes from the Jews of London to the rabbinic figure in Salonika, informing Eastern Sephardi Jewry of what was happening to their brethren in Jamaica. So it's a pretty small world, and it's all kind of connected in a broader pan-Sephardi network of identity. So the result of this was very significant, because it led to the Jewish community really relocating to Kingston and to Spanish Town, which was the political capital of Jamaica. And so you have a shifting in the gravity of Jewish settlement. By 1704, synagogues are built in both places. Jews invest in burial sites. And it's really in Kingston and in Spanish Town where you have very significant Jewish communities develop. But there are scattered Jews throughout the island, in Lucy and Savannah Lamar, and Black River, where there emerges an Ashkenazi enclave in the parish of Westmoreland, deep in the southwestern coast of Jamaica, which was a rival slaving port to Kingston. Now, one major change that's brought about also by the earthquake is an attack on the civil liberties of Jews in Jamaica. There is a tax that's imposed on the Jews that's going to be in place until 1740, so a collective tax. And this is very different than Jews in Western Europe, who don't pay these kind of collective taxes. It was similar to a method employed in Barbados. So it wasn't completely unique to Jamaica, but what was unique to Jamaica was a very energetic lobbying campaign that took place in a transatlantic context that used to fight the tax. And in some cases, the Jewish lobby was effective in reversing a tax, and in other cases, not so much. And one good example of when the Jewish tax in Jamaica really was, the Jews had no leg to stand on, was during the first Maroon War. So as the Jamaican militias are fighting autonomous, formerly enslaved communities in the north coast of Jamaica, in Portland Parish, Jews are accused of selling gunpowder to the Maroons and thereby undermining the British presence. And so that leads to a exacerbation of the tax, and the Jews really have no recourse to fight it at that point, because it's a claim that's very much believed. So this takes me into the, I tried to periodize Jamaican history a little bit in the book, because I found that in previous studies, it tends to be that that Jamaican Jewish history is talked about sort of in the same breath, like 1690s and 1780s. And I felt that that didn't do justice. So another distinct period that I identify is between around 1740 and 1770, which I characterize as a time of great hope and optimism for the Jews in Jamaica. The Plantation Act was passed in England, which granted citizenship to Jews without a naturalization act of parliament if they pledged to live in the island for 7 years. And so Jews in Jamaica vastly took advantage of that. Jews participated in the building boom of the 1750s and 60s. They renovated their synagogues in Kingston and Spanish Town. There seemed to have been a general prosperity that was built on the backs of the enslaved, because the 1760s is also the time of dramatic slave insurrections in Jamaica. Jews began also to participate more as planters as Jamaica transitions into an agricultural economy, sort of moving away from the mercantile economy of that's located in Kingston. And Jews are on the borderline of where Jamaica is going to go. It's inaccurate to overly characterize Jews in the Caribbean or in the early Americas in general as just being these merchants, because in fact they had much more diverse economic and professional interests. Okay, I'll just quickly wrap up my little discourse on the general history. The 1750s was a time of great optimism. And a Jew, Avram Sanchez Morao, who had been naturalized by the Plantation Act, decides that if I'm naturalized, why am I excluded from voting, right? Because Jews were disenfranchised in Jamaica, as were people of color, free people of color. And so so Avram Sanchez Morao very defiantly casts his vote for his member of assembly. Now, this was something that even the Jewish community in London did not appreciate. Their position was, why are you rocking the boat? And they actually censored Avram Sanchez Morao for doing that. So it tells you a lot about the limits of Jewish presence in Jamaica, but also the hope that they may have had in the 1740s and 1750s of greater equality. Now that equality never came, because when you come into the period of the 1770s, 1780s, and up until the moment of Jewish emancipation, which is a term that's used to describe Jewish suffrage throughout modern period. This was a time that I characterize as great reversals of the Jewish social status on the island. It was a time when there were moments of anti-Jewish violence, such as in 1783, when a mob threatened the synagogue on Kol Nidre, during the Ila on Yom Kippur, and threatened the synagogue with the Jews within. There was really political, I would say almost legal violence against the Jews when the uncle of Moses Montefiore comes to Jamaica in 1787, Joshua Montefiore. He was a kind of broad adventurer, and he wants to practice law in Jamaica. He's opposed by 60 attorneys on the grounds that he was a Jew. And this was a really sharp distinction from what was happening in England at the time, when Jews were becoming, I argue, better integrated in some ways than, and not always, than they were in the Caribbean. So this was, I think, a time of reversals. The anti-Jewish sentiments that are in the print culture of Jamaica in the late 18th century are very clear. And on top of that, there is a global conflict happening in the 1760s called the 7 Years' War, which has Caribbean theaters, which really played out in the Caribbean as a conflict between the British and the French. And the Jews in Jamaica were very much caught up in this conflict because they were always suspected of being kind of French. And that's because they were, because as were all Jews in the Western Sephardi diaspora, because those Pyrenees cities like Bayonne and Bordeaux had been the incubators for a lot of them of their return to Judaism or their adoption of an open Jewish identity. So like all parts of the Western Sephardi diaspora, Jamaica was very connected to Bayonne and to France in general. And so in the shadow of this global conflict of the 7 Years' War, the Jews in Jamaica were suspected of being treasonous. This led to some imprisonments, some depositions, other types of, some Jews were clearly being victimized for their French identity. In one case, kind of a dramatic case, a Jew from Haiti at the time, at the height, I would say, of the revolution in Haiti, called Yitzhak Yeshurun Sesportes, comes to Jamaica to try to foment insurrection in Haiti, like in Jamaica, like what was being seen in Haiti, which was the greatest fear of the governor of Jamaica at the time. And he failed, and he was executed and hung in Kingston. But it just reinforced to the ruler, to the British elite of Jamaica that the Jews were in league with the French. Probably the most famous Jew in Jamaica in the late 18th century, Alexander Lindo, who was from Bordeaux and was French speaker, did actually support the Napoleonic cause treasonously against the British. And so there was good reason for the Jamaican ruling elite to suspect Jews of maybe undermining the English imperial interests. Now, this really takes us to the moment of emancipation in 1826. The idea of Jewish suffrage is floated in the assembly and debated for several years, at least for 5 years. The Jewish community of London puts pressure on the Board of Trade to pressure the governor to issue, to try to influence the decision in the Jamaican Assembly. This is a very expensive process. And in fact, the Jews of London asked the Jews of Jamaica later on to pay them back for all of their efforts in trying to push through Jewish suffrage in Jamaica, and which succeeds in 1831, 6 months after free people of color are given the right to vote. And then in the 1840s, you start to see Jews really entering into politics, serving on assembly, and forming a relatively cohesive voting bloc with free people of color against the interests of the entrenched planters. And this is kind of where I stop my discussion of just Jews in Jamaica and generally what they did and what they were, and sort of the chronology of their presence. So in the time that remains, for about 10 more minutes, I want to talk a little bit about my sources for this book, the Last Wills and Testaments. So Ronnie asked that I talk a little bit about how I found them, and that's kind of an interesting story in itself. And that's also is completely thanks to Jane Gerber. And the way it happened was when I was doing my PhD, we had to write these qualifying papers. And I went to Jane's office one day and I said, Jane, I don't know what I'm going to do. And she says, well, you should use some original archives. And I have a friend in Jamaica, the great Ainsley Henriquez. And you should go there and see what's in the archives and do an exploration and write a paper about it. And we'll pay for it. So I'm like, okay, sure. And I went to Jamaica. This was in June of 2008. And I found notarial sources, which surprised me because they were so full of promise. And I had a hard time finding any real analysis of them. These documents are kept in the IRO at the Island Records Office of Jamaica, which is near Spanish Town. The Central Archives is in Spanish Town. And I also use a lot of sources that are in the Library of Jamaica, which is downtown Kingston. These are all wonderful places to work. They are very amenable. The staff at the records office would often like shudder when they saw me coming, because they knew it was going to be a lot of work. And I would make them pull out, in total, 400 wills. So I decided to take all of these wills together and see what can be learned from a social historical perspective by taking them as a holistic entity, which is something that really hadn't been done before. Wills had always been used as genealogical sources. They had been used, Leo Hershkovitz brilliantly used wills to kind of point to other sources and build profiles. But there hadn't been really any sustained discussion of what notarial wills tell us about Jewish society. And that was really my goal. So I put them all together, and they, like Ronnie said, they're very repetitive, they're very formulaic documents, and they're very removed from the voice of the testators themselves. So the wills that we have that exist in Jamaica and a lot of other parts of the Western Sephardi diaspora and other parts of the world in the 18th century are notarial documents, meaning that they are the copies of the original documents that were upon which a testator took an oath and signed the name. What we have is a probated document. So the notaries take the original and they copy it into a book, and that's what we have. So we don't have their original signatures or original handwriting or anything like that. So they're already pretty well removed from the voice of the testators. Wills are also a very limited document for social history because really they represent only a will-making elite. People they're usually propertied people, and so it rules out a large portion of, especially in the Caribbean, when most Jews in the Caribbean were not rich international traffickers or merchants. In fact, the vast majority of Jews in the Caribbean, and especially in Suriname and Jamaica, these plantation societies, were poor, indigent Jews that were being dispatched from metropole communities in Europe to go to the Caribbean. So they're very much lost. Their voices are very much lost in the process of just studying wills. So what are we supposed to learn from these wills? They tell you nothing about theology or about anyone's personal expectations or beliefs. They don't tell you really where did I come from and what was my position on the Inquisition. Those kind of things are left to Ronnie. Ronnie mines that kind of autobiographical content from Inquisition dossiers brilliantly. But you can't do that from wills. There is no personal element to them. They're very formulaic, and they're done in a way that's professionalized. Notaries have a kind of template that they use to standardize the language, and that's what they do. So so I took them a whole bunch together, and these are kind of the aspects that I was able to find in the wills. And one more point that I'll make is that in most parts of the Western Sephardi diaspora, wills were also being probated with the Jewish community. And those are a different layer of wills that are yet to really be explored. Especially in Livorno, there are hundreds of these wills that were filed with the Jewish community internally. So those could tell you maybe something else than what I found in probate wills. So one thing that I found interesting was the Diaspora Connections. Just kind of figuring out where the beneficiaries were of testators and wills. And doing that, it helped me to build a profile of what is the international dimension to the diaspora that is centered in Jamaica. So, and I found, interestingly, that if you look at who is receiving inheritance from Jamaican testators, that the contacts between Bayonne and southern France do stay very strong. They stay consistent, right, over time, even though the connections between Amsterdam are disappearing over the course of the 18th century. So I found that Amsterdam ceases to really be a major metropolitan influence in Jamaica as you move throughout the 18th century. And that has, I think, very important implications historiographically. And this is because the 18th century has always been understood to be a period of cultural and social decay for the Jews of the Jews of the Portuguese diaspora. There was the great 17th century, the Dutch golden era, the age of Spinoza and Oriol de Costa and Menashe ben Israel. And then after the 18th century, there's this really little interest in it, because the argument had gone that there's an economic and social and cultural decline. And part of my argument is that's only true if you look only at Amsterdam. And if we sort of shift the focus of diaspora, where periphery becomes more central, then you find still a really burgeoning diasporic identity in Jamaica. And the connections between peripheral communities stay very consistent, whereas relationships between metropolitan communities tends to change. So that's one really important aspect that I was able to mine through the study of wills. Other elements are things like public piety. So they don't tell you their ritual beliefs, but you do find things like donations to synagogues, charitable bequests, escavot, which are like the Portuguese inflection of memorial prayers. And all of these tell us something about a social identity of Jews that are connected in their local milieu to a Jewish community. And it also tells us a lot about the public role of women, which is something I'll kind of leave to the side, because I think probably one of the most profound aspects of the wills is the Jewish relationship and entanglement with the enslaved. So we find from wills, of course, that Jews are obviously large-scale slave owners in the Caribbean and in Jamaica, especially plantation societies like Jamaica and Suriname. Jews have no distinctive qualities in their patterns of slave ownership than anybody else. They did not manumit slaves with any greater frequency than did non-Jews, and all of that is evidenced through the study of wills. But also the very flexible and fluid marriage patterns and sexual patterns of Jews living in a slave society. So on the one hand, wills tell us that the Portuguese Jews of Jamaica were deeply endogamous. They ideologically married among themselves. At least that's evident from wills. That is, it was even taboo to marry Ashkenazim, as it was throughout the Western Sephardi diaspora. And in some wills, the testator will make a specific injunction not to marry an Ashkenazi. So my daughter gets this inheritance as long as she doesn't marry a Benjamite, like the other surviving tribe, the Benjamites. Whereas Sephardim are Judites, right? They are all potential messiahs. So that is that's interesting. But as much as this endogamy is happening, at the same time, Jews in Jamaica are completely acculturated to the norms and social norms of life in a slave society, which often translates into sexual relationships with women of color. And that's not unique to the Caribbean. This is very true, by the way, in the Ottoman world, where it was a frequent occurrence that men would purchase slaves from the Black Sea region, usually, and even transparently as sexual slaves. And this was something that was even talked about in rabbinic discourse. So it's not specific to the Caribbean that Jews were slave owners and that they exploited their slaves sexually. And that happened in Jamaica a lot. And what was amazing was that those relationships were so transparent in the wills, especially when there was a potential beneficiary of an estate, the offspring. And so wills help us to then try to negotiate what is the role of children of color within the family in a place where there are no communal sources. And that's another reason why wills are so deeply effective in studying Jamaica, because there were no surviving communal records, unlike somewhere like Suriname, where there's lots of communal records that tell us great detail about how people of color interacted with the community and with the family. But in Jamaica, we have to infer from those surviving records, or we have to make implications from the study of wills. Now, these relationships took many different forms. In some cases, they were clearly rape. In some cases, we're talking about a concubinage of single men who preferred not to get married and rather free themselves of the obligation of marriage. And that is because, according to English law and most other parts of the Western world, wives are always entitled to 1/3 of a husband's estate, and it's very hard to deny them that. So by living with a woman, a free woman of color who lacks agency and who is subaltern herself, is a good way of trying to avoid the obligations of marriage, and it's a relatively common and socially accepted occurrence. Another common feature you see is married Jewish men living with bywives. Sometimes they clearly have a legal status. In Jewish law, there's no problem with this, like they're pileg shot, and they're given, and they clearly have such status as pileg shot. And in some cases, they seem to be possibly operating in the role of surrogates. And so I find that it's relatively common that in cases where a married Jewish male refers to his concubine and their children, is often in cases when there's no evident surviving children from the marriage, which may suggest concubinage and surrogacy, which was also a relatively common Jewish practice in Italy and in the Ottoman Empire. So there's a lot to disentangle here. I know, and I guess I've exhausted my time, and so I hope I was able to give a kind of tasting menu and a broad overview of what my book offers and what are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in the book, and so I'm really thankful for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
First, thank you so much. Really wonderful and very informative, and so much out there. And I'm going to echo Ronnie's comment on being a Benjamite. It's a new one for me that I just saw before also. So proud Benjamite. How's that?
I'm a proud Benjamite too.
I am going to open up the. I'm going to open up everybody's, if anybody wants to open your cameras or open your microphones. And in the meantime, there are actually, do you want to go into the Q&A? Do you want me to read it to you? It's quite an interesting question.
Yeah. Well, actually, if you don't mind.
Sure. So Mark writes that this woman said that she's part of actually a more indigenous community in.
Go ahead.
That's a more indigenous community from Jamaica, that they're not Ashkenazim or Sephardim. He posits that it might be from a West African, from the Igbo tribe or something like that. Mm-hmm. And he said, if you can just, in a few words, sum up if there is this indigenous Jewish or somewhat indigenous tribe or community there. Ronnie is actually in a good position to address that, since it sounds to me like a kind of Antonio de Montesinos story, right? I mean, I'm unaware of any kind of indigenous Jewish or even Ten Lost Tribe mythology connected to Jamaica. I just haven't seen it. It's possible it exists. It's also possible that
that Jews were living as conversos, that those that became Jews were living as conversos in the Spanish world, and they may have very well kind of formed a separate social class within the open Jewish community of Jamaica. And that's all speculative. The problem with the conversos is that there's not very many records about their presence in Jamaica. But if other parts of the world are any indication, like in Italy, when openly Jewish communities often had conflict with returning Portuguese Jews, that it might suggest that perhaps if there was something close to an indigenous Jewish community of Jamaica before the arrival of Portuguese or Ashkenazi Jews, and of course, as Ainsley always points out, Ashkenazi is also a homogenizing term, and it's true, absolutely true. And so, that's the best I could suggest.
Well, we might want to let Professor Brett Schneider said that she may have. Do you want to? I don't know if she's out there yet. Oh no, hold on. Sorry. Okay. Well, she may come on in a moment and add to that because she said much exists in relation to those of African heritage. So she may add to that.
It's a very fair and good point because there are some deep similarities, especially circumcision. Like a lot of West Africans practice circumcision completely independent of any Islamic or Judaic tradition. And so a lot of the slaves that were being brought to the Americas, especially in Suriname and Brazil, were already circumcised. And so that may have created a level of familiarity between the Jewish community and people from West Africa. I'm reluctant to say Igbo because it's hard to identify one like ethnic group from West Africa that were dominant in the Americas. So I mean that's one possibility. There were conversos living in Portuguese Africa. There's been some excellent studies about this too, and so that also may be another possible avenue to explore this question.
I think you answered another question in the meantime. I'm going to also read you from Jose. He actually grew up in Jamaica, so that's an interesting thing. I don't know if you're on, Jose, and if you want to ask a question. But,
I am.
Oh, okay, you can ask your question.
Yeah, so I wondered if Professor came across in those wills or archives the names such as Henriquez, De Souza, De Cordova, De Paz, those kinds of names, which I'm familiar with current families in Jamaica.
Oh.
Yeah, I've seen all of the above. All of those names are represented in the will record. In fact, I have shared my entire all of my notes from the wills. And so when I looked at wills, I broke down the kind of the beneficiaries and their relationship to the testator because I knew that this would be very valuable to genealogists. And I've shared that document with the folks at the Sephardic World, Ton and David Mendoza, so they have access to all of that. And that was my contribution to genealogy. But I defer to you have the greatest living expert in Jamaican genealogy right here on Zoom, Ainsley Henriquez. So he's really the guy that would be better suited to answer such a question.
Yeah, I was going to actually give a shout out to Ainsley, so thank you for joining us too. Sharon is asking, what did you mean by surrogacy? You mentioned that sometimes the Pilegesh was a surrogate.
Yeah, simply that that she was a mother used for the purposes of procreation. Now this is interesting because in cases when there's very little coercion of Judaism among children of color in wills, though it occurs sometimes. So in some few cases, you'll see a testator will say, I want my children to be brought up as Jewish. And if they aren't, then they're not going to get this inheritance. So in some cases, also with Ashkenazim, you see such, what I would think is kind of coercive. language to try to ensure a Jewish identity for children of color. In those cases, though, almost always the woman who's identified as their mother, and wills will always tell you the kind of colonial the colonial skin color, the complexion of a woman that they're referring to, because it was a deeply colorist society that had these sort of racial these racial terminologies to define how close you are to a white ancestor. And so you get that distinction in the will. And then you'll find that in some of those cases, the mothers are asked not to have anything to do with the education of the child, probably for fear that she may be suspected of not really knowing Judaism. And so that is, but then the question is, how are they Jewish? And this is something that, by the way, Aviva Ben-Or, who writes about Suriname, does a great job in her recent book on Suriname, trying to figure out, like, at what point does Jewish halachic criteria of being Jewish and sort of other social realities, at what point does one end and the other begin? And really rather elastic definitions of Jewishness sometimes.
Thank you. I'm going to say Ms. Johnson because I'm not sure how to pronounce your first name. Do you want to ask your question, or would you rather I read it?
Thank you. My question relates to my own family, which is the Nunez family from Savannah, Georgia, arrived from Portugal via London in 1733. And historians now have developed the concept of the Atlantic community. And so I wondered if there's evidence of contact between Jamaica and Jews in other parts of the Caribbean, such as Curacao, you already mentioned Barbados, but also those on the northern side in North America, such as Savannah and New Orleans or other communities. Do you have any records of contacts among those communities?
Yeah, you're so you articulated that so well, because we really are talking about Atlantic world methodologies now, and so it's really almost impossible to study any one of these communities, be it Curacao, Barbados, Suriname, smaller communities like Statia or Nevis. You can't study any of them in isolation one from the other. They're all deeply interconnected. And that's one point that I try to make in the book, is that they're really a diasporic entity, which means they transcend, just like the Atlantic world is all about transcending nation state borders. And that's right. And so what's the difference between Savannah and Kingston? It's irrelevant, right? Especially in those cases, because they're both part of the same imperial structure. But what I find with Jews is that they are identified as a diaspora and not really connected to any one imperial entity, right? Their metropole is always going to be Amsterdam in some way, and they're less connected to the British Empire or the Dutch Empire. So that said, there are a lot of cases when Jews in the English world try to stay within the English world. So like in Suriname, when Suriname is taken by the Dutch in 1664, from the British, a lot of those Jews that were living in British Suriname decide they want to relocate to Barbados and Jamaica because their trading contacts are already within the British imperial structure, and it's not so easy to trade across imperial borders, especially the Dutch and so there are these imperial connections. Now, with North America, Jamaica is deeply connected to North America, especially to New York. So New York is a very small Jewish community in the 18th century compared to Jamaica. It's absolutely infinitesimal, I would say, compared, we're talking about, because New York is one Portuguese community, whereas Jamaica is multiple. There's Jewish communities in Port Royal, Jewish communities in Kingston, Jewish communities in Spanish Town. But there are connections. So we find that New York is exporting some kosher meat, salted kosher meat to Jamaica, which is kind of curious because Jamaica is a larger population and they definitely have their own butchers that are referred to by Edward Long and others. So why are they importing meat from somewhere else, especially when it's kind of suspicious? So the rabbi in Jamaica, Joshua Hezekiah de Cordova, from Ottoman origins, has a problem with the way that meat has been sealed. And but that's an important connection. Now to Savannah, I don't know any one specific link, but the story of Savannah is critical in understanding the Caribbean and also the Americas in general, because Savannah was a experiment. It was an experiment in a religious colony established by James Oglethorpe. So it was experimental for the non-Jews, for the colonialists, but also it was an experiment for the Jews because in 1730s, the Jewish community of London decided to dispatch poor individuals to Savannah to live there as a community. So it was a community that was completely designed from top down. It wasn't like New York. New York was a haphazard community that sort of developed over time. But Savannah was a kind of, right? It was a curated kind of community. And and also it ended. So in 1740, when the English were in war with the Spanish, the War of Jenkins' Ear, those Jews that lived in Savannah left and they went north. And but what you do find in the 1780s and 90s, as Jewish social status is being abraded in Jamaica, there are migrations out of Jamaica, especially to Charleston and to Newport.
Are you okay? We have one more question here. Oh, now there are two. I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that a lot of the migrations took place to a certain extent too by people looking for spouses and also mainly from an economic circumstances. We'll find Jamaican Jews in Australia, we find them in California, we find them in London in particular, and certainly through Savannah, as Stan has just indicated, and there are Nuneses in Jamaica. So whether they were actually connected to your Nuneses, I will do a little genealogical work and find out for you.
Yeah, you heard it from the expert. Here, yeah, one addition that I'll make to what Ainsley so rightly said was that the one point of migration throughout the Atlantic was being poor, because you're being dispatched. So this is a very common kind of scenario where a despachado, or a despachado in Spanish, when they're being dispatched from, let's say, Amsterdam, because Amsterdam is being is under siege from refugees. There are something like 30,000 refugees from Ukraine and Poland in the 17th century. And in the 1730s, there's a extreme amplification of inquisitorial investigations into Catholic conduct in Portugal. So 1730s, you get this big wave of migrants coming directly from Portugal, and they don't have anything. Their property had been confiscated, and so they end up in London, or they end up in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is at capacity, how much the social welfare infrastructure can sustain. So they dispatch these people to London, and then London says, well, we don't have enough to pay for you either. We'll pay for you to go to Jamaica. In Jamaica, then they'll dispatch you to Suriname, and Suriname may re-dispatch you to Barbados. So these people are very itinerant and they're hard to track. But what you see in communal records, especially in Suriname, and those that survived from Barbados, it was very common that despachados would be re-dispatched within the Caribbean after they got there. So it was the source of a lot of internal migration.
And I'll just add to this also, but as a side note, that we will be talking about Suriname in another few weeks with Viva Ben-Hur, so that's a separate thing. As you got called out, though, I have to say this, by Diane de Cordova. And her comment is, as a descendant of Joshua de Cordova, I'm curious to know more about the earlier reference made to his concern about meat.
Oh, okay, yeah. His concern about meat. I've actually written a lot about Joshua de Cordova. And so if you want to, I'm easy to find online, you can email me and I will send you my de Cordova research. And he's also a big part of the book, but what that reference is it's in the communal minutes, the Portuguese communal minutes of New York. And there they describe a situation where they were exporting salted meat and they were sealing it some way. You don't tell you how, but they were sealing it. And that's still done to this very day in kosher slaughtering. It has to be, whoever was supervising it has to sign it so that, and sign the seal. And if that seal is broken, then it's no longer fit for consumption. So the same thing goes with in the 18th century when they were exporting this meat to Jamaica, and Joshua de Cordova, who was a very fascinating figure for a lot of reasons, and I just didn't have time to get into him, but he wrote back to New York saying that he didn't accept the seal that they were putting on this meat, that he couldn't know for sure that no one had tampered with it. Who's to say that while it's en route to Jamaica, nobody was putting pig in it, you know? So that was his complaint. And that was recorded in the communal minutes in New York.
Thank you very much. I do want to make sure everybody is able to go, that we don't go too far over. Before I say formal thank you and goodbye, I want to make sure everybody knows about our upcoming next lectures. We're talking about Bukhara this coming week, this week and next week and the week after, so be sure. And then our New Works Wednesdays together with the Rabbi Arthur Schneer Program for International Affairs at Yeshiva University. We will continue with those also with Professor Gerber, who's here with us today. And then new work on Abravanel, which I thought was quite interesting, actually. And I have a certain affinity to Yemeni Jewry, and that's going to be on December 2nd. So please be sure to join us. And now I'll go back and let people say thank yous and goodbyes. And again, thank you so much to Professor Mirvis. I'm just trying to stop share. And if anybody wants to open your microphone, say goodbye, say thank you, and have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
A shout out to Ainsley. Ainsley and I attended the same school in Jamaica, in Kingston, Jamaica College. He was quite far ahead of me, as was his brother Richard, Zichrono Livracha. So we are very well acquainted from growing up in Jamaica. Nice to see
also, it's very nice to see some old friends here, Terry and Bailey. Nice to thank you for coming. I'm sure there's some other people here that I just don't see. I thought I saw Eli got by.
Yes.
Here, yeah.
Hi.
So there we go. Okay, well, it's nice to see everybody that I haven't seen in a really long time.
Okay, shalom.
Have a good day.
Thanks again.
So much.
Shalom.
Have a great evening and a great day. Thank you again. Bye-bye.